Meanwhile, a majority of voters seem to have backed the big spending budget unveiled by Josh Frydenberg last week. The latest news poll in The Australian showed 60% of voters believe the government's right to stimulate the economy, even if it lifts to increased debt. 30% say the government should rein in its spending and reduce debt. Asked whether they thought the Labor opposition would have delivered a better budget, 33% said yes, 46% said no. Let's bring in Stephen Hamilton now. He's economist at the Blueprint Institute. Says budget deficits are responsible in this context. Stephen, thanks so much for your time. Talk us through your analysis. You think that the Treasurer's copped a bit of unfair flack here?
I do, yes. I think the traditional view of debt and deficits is just not appropriate during a pandemic, right? I think we shouldn't forget that the pandemic's only been going for a year. Our economy, while it's rebounded well, it's still not, where it would have been this time had the pandemic not happened. There are still hundreds of thousands of people on, the dole now who weren't there a year ago. So there's some way to go. And if you look at the budget papers, it's quite clear that the level of deficits we have over the next 4 years are around the kind of support the economy needs to get unemployment back down below 5%. So I would be very concerned if the government started to hit the brakes at this point. I think they need to carry through with their fiscal strategy and continue to support the economy, at least for the next couple of years.
And you're surprised, in fact, by some of the criticisms from those that welcomed the big spend in response to the COVID pandemic last year, because we're 7 months on and the strategy in your analysis has not shifted a bit.
That's right. You don't pull spending out as soon as things start to look good, right? Then you risk the recovery, right? You need to keep that support there for a little longer to make sure that the recovery is bedded down. So the government's fiscal strategy that it configured last year is crystal clear, right? Separate the short-term budget task of supporting the economy during the recession, and then later, once the economy has fully recovered, start thinking about the structural issues that the budget faces. And we're just not at that point yet. So it's really premature to start to be talking about austerity, which is why I've been so happy that the Treasurer has gone out in the public and really gotten ahead of that and assured the public that they aren't going to raise taxes or cut spending anytime soon.
So that's the right message for now. When it comes to budget repair, when it eventually approaches, what should it undertake in terms of the Treasurer and the government's transparency on that?
While I think the short-term measures in the budget were really great, there's a lot of concerning signs. So, if people are concerned about the long-term situation with the budget, that's entirely appropriate. And it's something the government is going to need to look at seriously over the coming years. They have an intergenerational report coming up, which will give them a chance to be upfront with the public about the long-term spending pressures. So in the budget papers, for example, just in the next 4 years, the National Disability Insurance Scheme grows from a $20 billion cost to a $30 billion cost. Defence spending goes up by 20%, right? There are these huge pressures in aged care, childcare, right across the budget that in the long run, we're going to need to pay for. And that is going to require a really tough conversation, both about what services the Australian people are willing to fund and then how they're going to fund them, which means, a difficult conversation about tax reform, right? And our ability to raise additional revenue to pay for all of those things. And that's going to be a hard conversation.
We had the intergenerational report. Yeah, you remind us from Peter Costello back in 2002. There's another one looming. Could that be the mechanism by which the Treasurer then articulates his longer-term plan?
That's right. It was due out last year, but I think in the midst of the pandemic, they decided to reasonably push it out to this year. So it should be due at some point this year. Now, that sets out the long-term future for Australia. Like if we take today's settings and carry them forward, what is going to happen to our budget in the long term. If you look at the budget over the next 10 years, we're still going to be in deficit. So there are some serious structural issues in the budget that will need to be dealt with. Now, the Treasurer has a choice. There's an election coming in the next year. If the intergenerational report happens before that election, he has a choice about whether to be upfront with the Australian people about those pressures, right? And present his plan to the Australian people before the election about how he intends to pay for it, allow the opposition to do the same, and then allow the people to judge both of those plans on their merits. The alternative is to kind of push it off until after the election because you're a bit afraid of a kind of scare campaign on, spending cuts or tax increases. I think what he needs to do is be upfront, right? So I'd really want to see the raw, unfiltered numbers that the budget shows in the years ahead, and the kind of task that we have ahead of us to try and close that gap.
And, there is that spending in the short term, which obviously we look at it and you think, oh, that's got election written all over it, but then to come with that reality and the transparency in terms of how they're going to pay for it might be a big ask for a politician, but from an economist's perspective, you think it makes sense. What sort of measures are you thinking? Do you have in mind in terms of covering some of these structural spends now they're not one-off spends?
So we've spent a lot on aged care. We spent $17 billion, and that just plugged a hole. So that didn't even really address the full needs of the aged care sector that came out of the Royal Commission. So the aged care sector is going to need a huge increase in funding, something like $10 billion a year. So that's going to grow the deficit further. I think in the NDIS, where we have these extreme spending pressures, the government is going to have to make a decision about both who is going to be in the scheme, because there's a huge growth in case numbers, and also what kinds of services are going to be offered through the scheme. And I think if you look at the health budget over the last decade, we've actually done a pretty good job of containing spending growth in health. And I think we're going to need to bring that kind of focus to the NDIS, because we can't sustain a 50% increase over a 4-year period. I think the other issue is tax reform. So I think it's very clear to me that we're going to probably need to raise an additional 1% to 2% of GDP in additional revenue. And we can't rely on the income tax, which is just this huge burden on our kind of economy. I think we have to start looking at alternative sources for tax revenue. The trouble with that, Kieran, is that's a tough conversation. People don't really want to talk about raising and broadening the GST, or the tax treatment of superannuation, or the tax treatment of the family home, right? These are really tricky areas, but they're the kind of tough conversations we're going to need to have in order to balance the budget in the long term.
Stephen Hamilton, Chief Economist at Blueprint Institute, thanks as always. Appreciate it.
Cheers, Kieran.